All right, guys. So we're starting off at the end of the chapter where sixth grade and I were ending right before the break, and then we're going to jump into that chapter called No More Vacation. So the climax of the week actually came after that afternoon. It was an all-city jazz band rehearsal day, and when I got to the high school, I found out that Brian was at home sick. And Brian was their drum player, if I remember right. Because of that, I got to play the drum set for an hour and 40 minutes straight. I was smoking too. I always play well when I start out in a bad mood for some reason. And plus, I've been practicing so much that my wrists were just super quick. We played through some of our old repertoire, our usual repertoire, like the theme from this old 1970s TV show called Barney Miller, and some old jazz standards from the 1940s, and a Disney medley, which was actually far cooler than it sounds. Then we got into one of the new Latin pieces, a Dizzy Gillespie song called Manteca. Without two drummers, I had to play crazy fast to make the percussion parts sound full enough. My right foot was pounding out the accents, my left foot was clicking the hi-hat cymbals on beats 2 and 4, my right hand was going back and forth between the cowbell and a crash cymbal, and my left hand was flying from the snare drum to the tom-toms and back, and suddenly, a rare and amazing thing happened to me. I was in the zone. Now, you know how baseball players sometimes talk about games when the ball seemed to be just coming at the bat in slow motion, or looking like it was a giant freeze-frame cantaloupe just waiting to be pounded by the bat? That's how this felt, like I could do no wrong. I was so far inside the beat that I wasn't thinking at all. My body just did everything perfectly, almost like by itself. Mr. Watras, who usually grades papers while a student conducts us through practice, stopped what he was doing to watch me. I could see a huge grin on his face, but I wasn't affected too much by that until I remembered it later. I was just grooving on autopilot. Then Renee, which is the girl that he has a crush on, Renee walked in to visit her boyfriend, Biff the guitar wonder. She must have come straight from varsity cheering practice. She was one of only 3 eighth graders who got to practice with the high school squad because she was wearing her uniform. That's how I knew. I hope to God that she'd been watching for a while before I noticed her, because as soon as I looked up, the shock of seeing her there, wearing only small amounts of lycra and spandex, and looking right at me, knocked me right out of the zone. Far out of the zone, as in, ooh, Pez, you dropped a stick, right in the middle of a song, and it went tumbling across the room at about 90 miles per hour, and it smashed into the bell of some senior's trumpet. And who knew that brass was so flimsy anyway? By the way, the sound of a high school jazz band falling apart in mid-song while one of the trumpet players is screaming at the drummer at the top of his lungs and the piano player is in the throes of a mad laughing fit, it's just not something you really want to hear. And it's certainly not something you want the hottest girl in 8th grade to hear. Renee looked away, but there was definitely a hint of a pleased smirk on her face for a split second. Then I was distracted by the senior trumpeter's raging top-volume, spit-spewing barrage of verbal abuse in my face. By the time Mr. Watras had stopped this guy from busting me open like an overstuffed piñata, Renee was gone. I was kind of mortified, and Annette, my best friend, was still kind of snorting and giggling away, which made for a fun ride home. Although at least she couldn't snicker uncontrollably and bug me about my homework record at the same time. The next morning, my mom and Jeffrey returned from Philadelphia. So, here's our next chapter, No More Vacation. If you're like me, you wake up on a nice Saturday morning in the autumn, and you want to smell the crisp fall air, sit halfway up, stretch, and then go back to sleep until about noon. But if you're like me on this particular Saturday morning, you also want to wake up so you can see your mom and your brother when they get home. Somehow, at least half of me believed that Mom and Jeffrey would come hopping out of the car, run into the house, and share a good laugh with my dad and me about the little false alarm they'd been through. You know, like, those silly doctors, can you believe they mistook a nosebleed for leukemia? Psh, it's so ridiculous. And then I'd pout for a while about how my mom hadn't called me all week, and tease Jeffrey about how chubby he was getting from all the cheesesteaks and soft pretzels he got down in Philly, and then we'd go back to sleep for a nice lazy Saturday nap. When my mom finally pulled into the driveway, though, I saw that Jeffrey was asleep in the back seat, and I started to get kind of nervous. Jeffrey never, ever used to sleep on car rides. I'm a big car ride sleeper, maybe the biggest. But Jeffrey was usually just kind of blabbing away for hours and hours on end on any kind of road trip. Once we drove to the Outer Banks for a vacation when Jeffrey was 3, and he stayed up until after midnight on the way down. At about 10 p.m., while he was giving me a lecture on the various rescue heroes and why a voice tech rescue hero is completely different from a body force rescue hero, my parents pulled off the highway into a Cracker Barrel and the restaurant and rented a Charlotte's Web book on tape just to shut him up. But even then, he made my mom stop the tape every 15 minutes so he could ask long strings of questions about the book. Have you ever tried to sleep while a pint-sized maniac is rattling off hundreds of detailed questions about the web-spinning mechanics of a common barn spider? Granted, it was strangely amusing to watch the accountant and the English teacher attempt to explain arachnid biology, but overall, I was ready to strap myself to the roof track by the time Jeffrey finally nodded off. Just in time for us to arrive at our rental house, so he could wake up again, ask a million new questions about the locale, the sleeping arrangements, what pajamas he should wear, and why Steven always gets to sleep on the couch when all he gets is a stupid bed. Anyway, that's why a sleeping Jeffrey didn't strike me as a reassuring sign. My mom left in the car and walked up to the door to hug us. When she took off her sunglasses, I couldn't believe how old and tired she looked. After my hug, she stepped back for a moment, and I made a pretty major social blunder. So, Mom, everything's okay, right? This whole cancer mistake is all sorted out? She looked at me like I just asked her for a cigarette. Steven, this is no time to joke. Your brother's a very, very sick boy. He is? I just figured it was all a big mistake. Mistake? Mistake? Well, when you didn't call and all, I just assumed that... What do you mean I didn't call? You know I spoke to your father every single night. Well, no, Dad never actually... You didn't tell him that I called? You didn't tell him anything? He at least knows about Jeffrey's condition, doesn't he? Honey, oh boy. There was something going on here for sure. But I wouldn't find out much about it right then, because Jeffrey woke up right at that instant and knocked on the car window. My mom immediately jogged back out to him. My dad gave me a sheepish look and then started off slowly after her. I could tell by the slouchy way he was walking that he didn't exactly relish the thought of arriving at the car and facing his angry wife and sick son, but on the other hand, he certainly couldn't just stay in the doorway because then he'd have to face me. I stayed inside while my dad made a big show of grabbing the bags from the trunk and my mom carried Jeffrey in. And Jeffrey looked really beat too. Although his black eyes had faded to yellow now and his nose had gone back to normal from the nosebleed. I was afraid of what I'd say to him, but as usual, I was worried about the wrong thing. I should have been afraid of what he would say to me. He started right in, and although his voice was kind of gravelly, the words came out at lightning speed. Steven, you should have seen it. The hospital was huge, and I had a real bed, and you can move it. The head sat up, and the feet did too. And the doctors came and put a needle in my back, and then I couldn't move for an hour. But then Mommy got me a cool book about knights in shining armor, and she sat on the floor and read it to me upside down so I wouldn't be bored. But I was anyway. And then they gave me a sleepy medicine and put a special tube in my chest called a catheter. And then another time they put a needle all the way in my hip bone and it hurt. And then they put some stuff and took some stuff out of my bones and they called it bone marrow. And then my bone marrow is sick. So they put another needle in my back yesterday with the throw-up medicine. And then I had a needle stuck in my chest for 5 days. He paused to look at my mom for confirmation. 5 days, right, Mommy? When I pushed up off her shoulder to look at her, when he pushed off her chest to look at her, I looked too, and I couldn't believe it. She was crying silently. Her voice came out all trembly when she said, yes, baby, 5 days. 5 days. I was standing there with my head just reeling. My brother was really sick, so sick that they had to stick a needle in him to take out the marrow from his bones. He was so sick that they had to stab a needle into his spinal cord. He was so sick that my dad couldn't bear to tell me about it, and my mom was instantly crying as soon as the details were mentioned. And everything I'd been thinking all week was 100% wrong. My mom recovered enough to ask Jeffrey if he wanted a snack, but he turned kind of green and said he wasn't hungry. I found out later that he'd begun chemotherapy for his disease, and that one of the many side effects was nausea. "Can you put me down? Can I hug Daddy?" "Of course, honey." "Daddy, I missed you." Despite my shock, I remember thinking, well, you didn't miss much this week, dad-wise. "And I missed you, Stephen. I thought you might be lonely without me, so I got you a souvenir." At this, Jeffrey pulled something out of his pocket. It was a box of orange Tic Tacs. I couldn't believe it. In the middle of this horrible experience, Jeffrey had thought of me. And he had even managed to find me a box of my favorite little candy. I thanked him, and I really meant it, which wasn't always the case when I showed gratitude to Jeffrey. I remember when he was maybe a year old, Jeffrey went through a phase of picking up random objects from the floor and giving them to one of us. Usually me. I'd be in the middle of building a gigantic Lego space station or whatever, and he would come toddling over and present me with this month's copy of Better Homes and Gardens or the TV remote or a used tissue or something. And my mom would make me stop what I was doing and say, "Thank you, Jeffrey." I hated it at the time, and my annoyance was blinding me to just how generous my little brother actually was. Okay, before this turns into some kind of weepy love fest, I'll tell you what happened next. I took out the Tic Tacs, popped one into my mouth, and offered one to Jeffrey. He held out his hand, pinched the Tic Tac between his thumb and his pointer finger, flipped it into his mouth, and promptly threw up right onto my sneakers. My first reaction was to shout, "Jeffrey! Mom!" Jeffrey looked up at me with the hurt little deer in the headlights eyes he gets when I yell at him and ran to the bathroom. My mom told me not to move, got a white plastic kitchen garbage bag, made me step onto it, and then took my sneakers off of me as I stepped off of the bag. My dad was just kind of staring at everything with a baffled expression until my mother told me to go after Jeffrey. Or told him to go after Jeffrey, sorry. Then she turned back to me and told me to stay still, even though I was dying to take off my favorite sweatpants, which had now gotten gore spattered on the cuffs. She was dialing her cell phone at top speed, which I couldn't figure out until she started talking into it. "Hello, this is Mrs. Alper, Jeffrey Alper's mother. He's a patient in clinical trial number 366. They told me to call if he..." "Okay, I'll hold." "Mom, what's going on? Why do you have to call? Is this the nurse?" "Okay, Jeffrey left there 2 hours ago and he just vomited. What should we do?" I was thinking a quicker cleanup might have been a great place to start, but nobody was asking me for guidance here. In fact, my mom was leaning way down by the garbage bag, examining the vomit, and any interruption of this bizarre task did not seem wise. "No, there's no blood in it." "Well, my older son gave him a Tic Tac, orange. Do we have to adjust his meds?" "Yes." "And you'll fax the adjustments to Dr. Puro here. Shall I call him in about an hour?" "Okay, thanks." She hung up and turned to me. "Stephen, we have to be really careful with what Jeffrey eats for a while." As I took off my sweats and my mom started on my sneakers with some paper towels and a can of carpet cleaner, I muttered, "Now you tell me." My mom stopped, looked up at me, and laughed a little, and surprised me with a quick hug. "I missed you, Stephen." "I missed you too, Mom." "Now go tell your brother you're not mad at him, okay?" And I actually realized that I really wasn't mad at him. All in all, this had been quite the morning for surprises. I went into the bathroom, threw my socks in the hamper, they looked clean, but, just in case, and put my arms around Jeffrey. My dad was there, sitting on the closed toilet seat, trying to be comforting, but he really hadn't gotten his bearings yet with this whole cancer situation. I think he was relieved when Jeffrey leaned right into me. I started my old trusty, "Hush, Jeffy," chant. My dad tiptoed out, and after a while, Jeffrey calmed down. I looked right into his huge blue eyes and said, "Jeffy, it's okay. I'm not mad at you for throwing up on my shoes. Can you do me a favor next time, though?" "What?" "Please aim for my dress shoes, because I hate them." "Okay, Stephen." "Now, let's go brush the taste out of your mouth and go, I don't know, maybe for a drum lesson?" "Yay, a drum lesson!" Our chapter's kind of long here, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there for today. So that way this video isn't a million hours long, but we'll pick back up, and then in just about a couple more pages, we'll be into our next chapter called Take Me. Peace out.